Oh, hello, and welcome to Quick Player. I'm going to check to see if this works. This is so hard. New movie recording. Hello. Let's make sure this works as well. I wonder if there's going to be overlap now. Okay, well, let me just say, this is the third attempt. I am feeling a little like I'm losing my mind with the technology, but this is the third attempt. I believe in this third attempt. I believe that I can make a video that will record. I believe in this. Okay, welcome to the brief video series. Brief, why? Because we cannot master the technology and we fear losing more time. Wasting more time. Alright. Repetition and punctuation. I wanted to show you 3 instances where poets repeat a sentence, in my opinion, in part, to show punctuation. To me, punctuation is an unsung hero of poetry. It conveys so much emotion and meaning, but nobody cares about it when they read as much. They just don't care as much. Because, well, the words are much flashier than the punctuation. And honestly, our sensitivity to the difference between commas and periods is trumped by our sensitivity to words. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you have "oh hear me" and you feel that that's a moment where you're just in the flow of things, you'll just rush through that sentence. Or, despite the period. Periods be damned. And if, on the other hand, you feel that the comma there doesn't appropriately convey your emotional intensity because you want to scream that line, you'll treat that comma as an exclamation mark. No problem. Not yet born, oh, hear me! We have this loose attitude towards punctuation. We treat it as secondary to our own feelings about the poem, I believe. So, one of the things poets do, and I've found this in 3 of the dozen or so poems we've done in the anthology, and I think that it's there in other poems as well, in our anthology even. And the reason being that they're saying, listen, we did invest a lot of time, a lot of effort into punctuating this poem. The periods and the commas are important. You know how important they are? We'll repeat the exact same line, but we'll just change the punctuation. Alright. So, I've given you a writing template because I think this is a very complicated idea, which is to say, from repetition, we go to the isolation of punctuation, that's move 1. From that move of isolating the punctuation, we go to the meaning and emotion of the poem, that's 2 moves in one kind of topic sentence, and those are hard moves, so I figured if you had some phrasing to deal with them, it'll be easier. So, first, here are my 3 examples. How I miss my father. How I miss my father. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old man, old age, da-da-dum. And do not go gentle. Didn't even properly repeat. Into that good night. Period. Not yet born, oh hear me. Not yet born, oh hear me, continues. Okay. So, the repetition of the phrase, or sentence, or line, and we give our reader the actual quote, helps the reader see the change in punctuation from the period ending of stanza 1 to the exclamation mark of stanza. And of course you could change that to from the comma to the period, we will see. It's basically a clean way of saying this shows us the punctuation here versus the punctuation there through the repetition. It's a completely different way of thinking of repetition, and I believe it makes a lot of sense out of these 3 individual poems as well. So, without further ado, since there's only a 50% chance, if that I'm actually recording as we speak, and that all of the recording will work just as I hope it would. The repetition of "do not go gentle into that good night" helps the reader see the subtle change in punctuation from the comma of stanza 1 to the period of stanza 6. Now, you might ask, why not the period of stanza 2? Why not the period of stanza 4? Well, this is where good choices are better than mediocre choices. So if I picked stanza 2 or stanza 4, that's a very, very rapid process to be describing. A change in attitude between the first stanza and the second stanza. Straight away, what are we? Romeo with Juliet? Straight away we move from "do not go gentle into that good night" to a completely different attitude towards death. It makes more sense for us to do it by stanza 6, to focus on a change in attitude from stanza 1 to stanza 6. But more importantly, in stanzas 2 and 4, he kind of doesn't have the option of a comma, because those are lines that end Villanelle stanzas, and it would be very, very strange for them to end on a comma. So it's hard for me to argue a change in attitude that is also forced by the laws of grammar. Whereas in stanzas 1 and 6, he has the grammatical option of a comma. He picks a comma and a period, despite having the option of 2 periods, 2 commas, and reversing that order. And it would change the poem considerably, in my opinion, if he did reverse the order. So, the repetition helps the reader see the subtle change in punctuation. We've moved from repetition to punctuation. Now, this change suggests that the speaker is more resigned towards his father's death as the poem continues. The comma suggests the flow of life is still in his father in stanza 1, but the finality of a period gently contradicts the rage towards death the speaker still demands of his father. Thus the sentence repeats to show us the subtle acknowledgement of death's growing presence in the poem. Now, this is an argument. Arguments, by their nature, are arguable. So you could say, what? This is not a poem where there's acknowledgement of death's kind of inevitable presence. This is a poem about rage against the dying of the light. You could. I, for one, feel that there's enough in the finality of a period that is being isolated by the repetition to suggest to me that he is coming to terms with the fact that he can say rage against the dawning of the light, but he also feels that that rage is futile. Right? His father's gonna die. Rage is not going to stop that from happening. So, one other way I see that is that he doesn't do any exclamation marks in this poem, which to me, for a poem about a lot of rage, to not have any exclamation marks is already showing a more sobered attitude. Kind of, rage against the dying of the light, but how much rage is there when you're dying? How much, something of a sense of how hard it is to demand rage from somebody else. And rage against one of the more passive activities you can undertake is die of old age. So, okay. Hopefully that clarified. I think if you wanted to add another couple of clarifying sentences or take this in a very different direction, I believe you definitely could. For instance, you could say that he's more decisive. He's more decisive. He's growing more confident. First, he's kind of rushing through his lines. But then, as the stanzas continue, at the end of the day, he's just definitive, like a period. Not my style of reading it, but it would be a fantastic reading. Two contradictory readings that are fantastic, in my opinion. Okay. The repetition of... So, moving to the second example, I think the second example, you guys can do like that. Meaning, I think you would get to the fact that she moves from how I miss my father to how I miss my father. I think you guys would get that that's more intense, and that shows that she's missing him more, that she's feeling the pain more. And I just added to this, so the repetition in stanzas 1 and 4 isolates the punctuation difference between the two lines. So subtle differences. Sometimes I just go the subtle change, sometimes I say this punctuation difference, I'm just go punctuational difference if you're feeling fancy, between the two lines. As the speaker moves from a period to an exclamation mark, and you can always say to end the line, etc. This suggests she experiences longing more intensely the more she thinks of her father, and I wanted this to add a layer of kind of nuance to this, so I said at the time, so more broadly time, rather than healing the wounds of death, actually salts them. So it is interesting to me that in most of our conception of life's experiences, the more time passes, the less intense the emotional experience. But in this poem, the more she thinks about her father, the more time passes in this poem, which granted is not that much time, but being lenient, the more intensely she feels something. It shows something about love if you can miss someone more in the 6th stanza than when you just think about them, or the 4th stanza. You'll notice almost all of these poems have quite the gap between the first repetition and the second, with the punctuational difference, because they really want to show you a process, I believe. So again, going back to from stanza 1 to stanza 2 in a 6-stanza poem, it's just not as much of a process can happen. Alright, my most ambitious / false argument of the 3. And I struggled with this. And I believe I also struggle with the spelling of names, embarrassingly enough. But I always believe in... Anyway. I wanted to, instead of going through the repetition, I wanted to give this to the poet. McNeice repeats the line. Why? Because sometimes, and I've also moved us from the reader to us. And why? Because sometimes in a test you're really stressed out, and abstraction is not your friend then, so it's easier to just think about a poet interacting with you, and it's just more immediate as a reading experience. I think it's less academic, but it's more assured, so it's a bit of a trade-off there. Definitely, I wouldn't just have this be the constant phrasing, us, but from time to time, definitely speaking about the poet and what the poet is doing is a good mixture to throw in there. It'll help you be clearer on your own thoughts, in my opinion, than thinking about the repetition. Repetition is so hard to grapple with sometimes. Whereas someone repeating something, you can sort of get more immediately. Alright, this is me repeating the same point about someone repeating. Hopefully you've gotten it by now. These videos, though they've all failed technologically, and this might fail technologically, they've also all had these tangents, I'm afraid. Just style of video making / inability to edit videos since I can barely record them. But also I enjoy tangents. I do. Okay, McNeese repeats the line, "I am not yet born, oh hear me," to allow us to see the subtle difference between the period ending the line in the first stanza and the comma ending that same line in the sixth. I think that's the clearest version of that thesis. This makes the speaker sound less restrained and more outraged towards his war-filled world, which is assuming I'm writing about the theme of war. I want to have that war-filled world, as he is no longer able in stanza 6 to fully stop himself before rushing forward with the urgent plea to be heard. In a way, the change in punctuation shows the reader growing more defiant and less fearful. I don't know, I'm not entirely sure that this is... I just feel like that's one reading of it that I could support. But even as the danger of the stanzas grows from animals and mythical creatures to beasts and would-be gods, this is the part that feels a little dangerous, a little risque, because you could say, well, you know what, bats and rats are pretty scary. And beasts? I'm not that afraid of beasts. And the man who thinks he's God? To me, I don't know. I find man who would be God and the beast, I find that more intense than the rat or the bat. But if you were to argue with me that he is growing more confident as he is coming to terms with the world, and the world is growing less scary, so that he sees that instead of a mythical creature, it's just someone pretending to be a god, I would absolutely buy that. I would think that's an excellent explanation. You'll notice there's a pattern in my readings, which is my readings can be wrong. I'm very proud of this. Very, very proud. If your readings can't be wrong, you're not reading. You're just summarizing. I think there has to be a little bit of freedom. A little bit of freedom. So, to recap. Repetition in 3 of these poems, and I suspect in quite a few more, isolates the change in punctuation, which in turn can give you a different sense of the speaker's attitude towards a theme. And I think that's really valuable because you'll often write about the speaker and death, or the speaker and war, or the speaker and identity, and it'll just be one attitude. Whereas poetry is often a process of changing things. They change in a subtle ways, like a period to a comma, but they change, so that you can talk about structures much more profoundly if you can show that through the repetition, isolating the punctuation. Then you can kind of layer that on top of, let's say, the fact that at this point she's seen so many things she can miss about her father. And at this point he's dealt with his father's dying for a while. And the punctuation changes. You go through things differently, you experience them differently, you express that experience slightly differently. Anyway, I could be talking to a vacuum yet again, but if I'm not, let me just say I will miss you tremendously, and I will try to make as many of these videos as my technology-deficient mind will allow. And thank you for being an amazing, amazing, amazing class. Honestly. One of the best. One of the best I've ever had. And for never criticizing my pantomime, which in this case was saying, thank you. This is my thank you. Okay. Let's see if this actually worked. Stop recording. Alright. And screen.